Okay, I believe it is now time for us to start. So good afternoon to all participants and welcome to today's webinar, The Prison Mission, Elevating Life Behind Bars, hosted by the Asian Law Students Association, National Chapter Thailand. Thank you to everyone for joining us here today at our very first kickoff webinar for the ALSA Thailand's Social Issue Series, Rolling in the Feed. Rolling in the Feed is a webinar-based informative discussion series providing insightful events regarding the legal aspects in current social issues. Today's webinar is the first episode of the series, and there will be a lot more interesting ones to come. Hope all of you had a good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. My name is Tanyapat Chaisiri, and I'll be your MC for today. Today's presentation will be separated into two main sessions. First, we have the honor of Ms. Edith Riegler to share her expertise on the backgrounds and problems of prisons, and also possible prison reforms. This will be followed by an interactive panel discussion session, and followed by an unmissable opportunity for participants to ask questions in the Q&A session. Therefore, if you have any questions during the presentation or the discussion, feel free to type them into the chat box, and the speaker will answer them in the later Q&A session. There will also be e-certificates for all participants who fill in 2 Google Forms, which will be provided at the end of the webinar, so stay tuned. Please also note that there has been a slight change in our event schedule, which will last until 2:50 p.m. If anyone is comfortable with turning on your camera, that would be highly appreciated. A live CC function is also available, so if anyone would like to see the captions during the presentation, please feel free to turn on the transcription function as well. As the webinar is about to begin, I'd like to invite the President of ALSA Thailand National Board to give a welcoming speech. Please welcome Mr. Nicholas Ransa.
Nelson Mandela used to say, "No one truly knows a nation until one has been inside its jail. A nation should not be judged by how it treats its highest citizen, but its lowest one." Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all the participants around the world. I hope you all are doing well, staying safe and healthy during this pandemic. I'm Nicholas Wansa, and it is my honor to be welcoming all of you to the Prison Mission, Elevating Life Behind Bars. Today marks the premiere of the first webinar of our newly launched Current Social Issue series, which we are proud to announce the title as Rolling in the Feed series. Firstly, thank you to all the participants. Your presence here today means a lot to us at ALSA Thailand. Secondly, thank you to Ms. Edith Riegler, our expert today, who took her time out of her busy schedule to educate and share her experiences with all of us here today. Lastly, thank you to my National Award team who made this event possible. I sincerely hope all of you will enjoy and acquire new knowledge today. ALSA, always be one.
Thank you so much to Mr. Nicholas for the wonderful speech. That was a very warm welcome for our participants. I'd like to remind everyone once again that if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box and the speaker will answer them in the Q&A session later. Also, I'd like to ensure that everyone has changed your Zoom name to your first name. And also, please keep your microphone muted to prevent any interruptions during the presentation. Therefore, without any further ado, we will now officially begin our event by introducing Ms. Edith Riegler. Ms. Edith Riegler is a project assistant at the Prison Reform Institution. The Prison Reform Institution is a non-governmental organization working globally to promote criminal justice systems that uphold human rights to all and provide aid to disadvantaged groups. Ms. Riegler's strong research background has impacted this field of study greatly in terms of criminal justice, human rights, and international affairs. With that being said, please welcome Ms. Edith Riegler to the floor.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to start my presentation now. Okay, so first of all, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for this invitation to speak today. I'm very pleased to address you all, and I hope that you will find my presentation interesting and worthwhile and maybe even useful. So thanks, you already said a few kind words about myself. I'm gonna elaborate a little bit in case this is interesting. I studied psychology in my bachelor, and then in my master's, I did criminology and criminal justice, writing my thesis on the concept of rehabilitation and international criminal law. However, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an expert on legal issues. I'm knowledgeable on criminological issues, but I will try to give you not just a perspective of international policy and advocacy, which is my background, but also I will try to bring some legal perspectives in that you might find interesting. So after my academic education, I had a few different positions within the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime in Vienna, specifically with the HIV/AIDS section in the Drug Prevention and Health branch. So this is my background with regards to human rights in prisons. And now I work with, as you just said, Penal Reform International. Right. So this is my organization. And as you said, we work around the globe. We have offices in many different regions where we work on the ground in prisons. However, I'm within the headquarters team working on policy and international advocacy. So our partners are governments, parliaments, state agencies, international state bodies, and different international organizations from the UN to the EU institutions, and also civil society organizations. So this is an overview of the topics I would like to cover. And I think it's best if I just jump straight in. So I'm going to start with a bit of an overview of the facts and figures relating to global prison trends. And most of this data is actually from PRI's Global Prison Trend Series, which is a publication that we publish every year, actually in conjunction with the Thailand Institute of Justice, where we identify key trends and challenges in prison systems worldwide. So in case you would like to have more information, more data, and also references and sources, you're welcome to look this publication up on our website, and you'll find it all there. So overall, in globally speaking, crime is not rising. However, the global prison population is rising. Over 11 million men, women, and children are in prisons around the world on any given day. However, if you look at the prison population over the course of a year, experts estimate that 30 million people are incarcerated in prisons each year, which means there's a lot of turnover, people coming into prison, leaving prison, and so forth. And most of these people are in prison for minor and non-violent offenses. The prison population has increased by 8% since 2010. Also, over 3 million people are in pretrial detention. This is also a figure that has increased a lot, by 30% since the year 2000. But the variation of the proportion of pretrial detainees varies in different countries. So, for example, in some countries, over 70% of prison populations are actually in pretrial detention, meaning they are presumed to be innocent, but are still treated as prisoners. And imprisonment is the default response to criminal offending in some regions. So there's variations, as we all know. Some people have low incarceration rates, and some countries have very high ones. For example, the US has the highest in the world. So per 100,000 people, 639 are in prison. So then we come to prison overcrowding, which is an issue in many countries across the world. In fact, in more than 118 countries, prisons operate above their capacity. And in 11 countries, prisons are at 250% of their capacity. As you can imagine, this has many health consequences, physical and mental health, for prisoners, and as well for prison staff who have to manage all these people. One consequence, for example, that is very concerning is tuberculosis, because tuberculosis is prevalent where prison conditions are crowded. Due to overcrowding, poor nutrition, and poor ventilation, tuberculosis rates, and also the rates of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis in many prisons are 10 to 100 times higher than in the community. And tuberculosis is also associated with HIV co-infection. So HIV and tuberculosis is among the main causes of death of people in prison. Then we come to the drivers of imprisonment rates. Why are there so many people in prison? One of the main causes is the overuse of pretrial detention. So the rates have been rising steadily, as I said before. For example, analysis by the World Prison Brief shows that a lot of variance between regions. In Europe, the rates of pretrial detainees has decreased actually by 28%, but then in other areas, in the Americas and in Oceania, it has increased a lot. For example, in New Zealand, the number has been quadrupled over the last 20 years. So this is a very worrying trend, of course. During the pandemic, some countries have tried to address the overcrowding in prisons and have actually looked at pretrial populations to release them, but with varying successes. And these developments have not been sustainable. So even though last year, a lot of countries have tried to lower the number of people in pretrial detention, now in most places, they're back to normal again. Also, there's mandatory sentencing, as well as longer sentences and the use of life imprisonment. This might be interested for those of you looking to become prosecutors and to work in the judiciary. Almost 500,000, so 500,000 people globally are serving life sentences. And around 65 countries impose sentences of life without parole. The number of people serving life sentences continues to rise as a result as well of a shift away from the death penalty. So there's fewer countries that have the death penalty, but instead there's more sentences of life imprisonment. There's also laws that criminalize certain non-violent offenses which drive incarceration rates. So I'm going to outline some of them in more detail in the next few slides. For example, drug-related offenses. The imprisonment of people involved in illegal drug markets, particularly people who use drugs, is a major contributing factor to prison overcrowding. So punitive drug laws have imposed disproportionate criminal sanctions and led to an estimated 2.5 million people worldwide in prison for drug-related offenses. Of these, 22%, so almost 500,000 people, are sentenced for drug possession for personal use. Several international bodies have criticized the use of detention for drug-related offenses as they're mostly non-violent offenses. And this is in line with the UN system common position on drug-related matters, which calls for alternatives to conviction and punishment for drug offenses, including decriminalization of drug use and possession for personal use. And in 2020 as well, the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights reiterated that the decriminalization of drug use is an impediment to the realization of the right to health. Despite the high rates of imprisonment, the World Drug Report by UNODC concluded that the illicit drug trade continues to expand and drug use is actually on the rise. So that means that even though there are harsh policies and laws related to drug use, this doesn't mean that they are effective. Drug use and drug crime is still on the increase. Then another cause for high imprisonment rates is petty offenses. So in some countries, poor or disadvantaged people are targeted by the law, whether directly or indirectly. This takes the form of imprisoning those who are unable to pay fines or taxes and criminalizing acts such as small-scale selling without a license or sleeping on the street. And in some countries, it's still possible to be arrested for being an idle and disorderly person, which is a common offense in Africa. Law enforcement officers also frequently use poverty, homelessness, or disadvantage as an indicator of someone being criminal. There are also some so-called status offenses that specifically target women, such as witchcraft or running away. Laws prohibiting witchcraft or sorcery are predominantly applied to women. This is, for example, the case in Central African Republic or in Papua New Guinea. Women also continue to be imprisoned under laws restricting their reproductive rights. So for example, when they have an abortion or a miscarriage, they can be arrested and detained for murder. There's also a link between poverty, drug offenses, and imprisonment. So many people who use drugs belong to vulnerable, poor, and socially excluded groups and are easy targets for law enforcement then. So drug offenses are often target low-level traffickers or people who use for personal consumptions and not big organized crime criminals. So efforts to address vague, arbitrary, and colonial era petty offenses have been stepped up over recent years. However, in many countries, they're still prevalent and in use. In Africa, at least 42 countries have laws against vagrancy, being idle, disorderly, or a rogue and vagabond, which are actually actively enforced. So now I'm gonna cover some international standards and human rights instruments. And I just wanna say that there is many of such instruments. Some are legally binding international conventions, and some are more regional guidelines and recommendations. I'm just gonna give you a brief overview, just a flavor of what those standards say. So I'm pleased that your president has already quoted Nelson Mandela, as he's very instrumental in the human rights of people in prison. The Nelson Mandela rules, the standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners, were first adopted in 1957 and revised 6 years ago, when they were then officially called the Nelson Mandela rules. They are often regarded by states as the primary, if not only, source of standards relating to the treatment of people in detention, and are also a key framework used for monitoring and inspection mechanisms to assess whether prison conditions are adequate. So these standards set up by the UN are not legally binding, but they offer guidelines that are often adapted then in national legislation. The 122 rules cover all aspects of prison management and outline the agreed minimum standards. So states can go above and beyond, but these are the minimum standards for the treatment of people in prison. So covering registration, exercise, medical service, discipline, transfer, and also the training of staff and so on. There's also then special provisions for people with mental health issues or people under arrest awaiting trial and detained without charge. However, these Nelson Mandela rules, they're very general. They're supposed to cover all people that are deprived of their liberty. And they are actually supplemented then by the Bangkok rules, which deal with the issue of women in prison. So they're called the United Nations Rules for the Treatment of Women Prisoners and Non-Custodial Measures for Women Offenders. They were adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2010 and fill a long-standing gap of standards providing for the specific characteristics and needs of women in prison. Because historically, prisons and prison regimes have always been designed for male people in prison, from the architecture to security to healthcare, work and training. So these 70 rules give guidance to policymakers, legislators, and prison staff to not only reduce the imprisonment of women, but also to meet their specific needs when they are imprisoned. The rules recognize that prison is usually ineffective and often even damaging for women because it hinders their social reintegration and their ability to live productive and law-abiding lives following release. They have guidance on healthcare, rehabilitation programs, training of prison staff, visiting rights, and so forth. They require women to be treated with humanity and with dignity as a basis. And they cover, for example, such issues of the restraint of women who are in labor or during childbirth, immediately after birth, the prohibition of solitary confinement of pregnant women, and also rules relating to breastfeeding mothers in prisons who have their babies with them in prison. Then we have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which came into force in 1976. This is a multilateral treaty, and Article 10 provides that any person deprived of liberty shall be treated with humanity and dignity. It also imposes the requirement of separation of prisoners in pretrial detention and those already convicted, and also to separate juveniles from adults. There's also a requirement that the focus of prisons should always be reform and rehabilitation, not just punishment. And the provisions in these covenant also apply not just to those in prisons, but in all places where they're deprived of liberty. So also psychiatric hospitals, detention facilities, or police custody. Then I'd also like to mention the UN system common position on incarceration, because it was just adopted this year, a few months ago. So there are several large bodies from the UN who work on incarceration, all addressing different aspects, different priorities. So this includes UNODC, UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, UN Department of Peacekeeping, and this document seeks to bring the work of all of these bodies together and speaks of a one UN approach that lays out some guidelines and recommendations. Most of it is not really new, however, there are a few areas worth noting. There is an emphasis on reducing prison populations, some attention to life imprisonment. It addresses discrimination, inequalities, also highlights the specific needs of women, and promotes decriminalization and depenalization as an important reform tool. Then, as I said, there's so many other rules that could be mentioned here, international ones, just as the Beijing rules, which are the United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for the administration of juvenile justice, and then also some regional rules and guidelines, for example, by the Council of Europe and so forth. But it will take too much time to go through all of those now. So the next topic I want to talk about is vulnerable groups in prison. All persons in prison are vulnerable when they come into contact with the criminal justice system. Yet many systems continue to be designed, as I said, for a homogeneous population, men mostly, and are discriminatory to different groups that have specific needs. Latest data from the UN shows that men constitute 91% of the adult prison population, and men account for 85% of adult convictions. So specific groups of people indeed require a distinct approach to protect their rights because they are especially at risk of violence or they are neglected. So specific groups with vulnerabilities are typically older people, LGBTIQ people, people with disabilities, ethnic and religious minorities, to name a few. So I'll talk about women in prison first. There's over 740,000 women and girls in prisons around the world, which doesn't sound so much compared to the general population, but it is a prison population that has been increasing at a faster rate than the male prison population. In fact, it has increased by 17% since 2010. Often, offenses committed by women are non-violent and are closely linked to poverty. So frequently a means of survival to support their families and children. Also, harsh drug policies have disproportionately affected women who often take part in low-level but high-risk activities, which is frequently also a result of coercion or driven by poverty. The increase in women's imprisonment is also an indication of some countries taking harsh approaches to women who commit offenses in the context of violence, coercion, poverty, or discrimination. So in some countries, women are imprisoned for status offenses, criminalizing specific behavior. I've also mentioned this before, including adultery, sexual misconduct, or prostitution. What is also really concerning is that in some countries, detention of women is used as a form of protection, for example, for victims of rape, to protect the victim and to ensure that she will testify against her rapist in court, which is very problematic, as you can imagine. Also, some studies report that as many as 80% of women in prison have an identifiable mental illness, and women in prison are more likely to harm themselves or commit suicide than men in prison, according to the World Health Organization. Women in the criminal justice system are also often victims of domestic or sexual abuse. And then throughout being in the criminal justice process, they are at risk of further abuse, violence, and humiliation from police, prison officers, or other people in prison. So for many women and girls in detention, being in detention can mean the threat of rape, touching, virginity testing, being stripped naked, invasive body searches, insults, humiliations, and also being forced to provide sexual favors for preferential treatment. Then gender roles and cultural expectations mean that women in prison face greater stigma than men. In many countries, women visit their husbands when they are in prisons, but husbands rarely visit their female partners when they are in prison. Then when women return home, they're often rejected by their communities and even by their families, and may struggle to rebuild their lives socially and economically. Also, what is something to keep in mind is that women in most places in the world are the main caretakers of children. So when the mothers are in prison, children are often the hidden victims. So they might suffer from the separation that a prison sentence might cause. So as per the Bangkok rules, for example, some countries have provisions that babies and very young children can stay with the mothers in prison if this is deemed the most appropriate solution. However, a childhood spent in prison can also damage a child physically and emotionally. So girls then, meaning women under the age of 18, are quite few, but they are most discriminated against. They receive even less attention and are less likely to have access to suitable education and vocational training in prison. And pregnant girls in prison especially are vulnerable. They face particular stigma, and they might not get the support that they need, especially when it comes to healthcare or counseling for physical or sexual abuse. So I already mentioned the Bangkok rules a few times before, but it's a really important international document which addresses the lack of standards reflecting the specific characteristics and needs of women in prison. And I think it's really important to note that they don't just govern the conditions in prison, but they promote the development of non-custodial sanctions for women in prison. So this is acknowledging that community service and other alternatives to imprisonment have been shown by evidence to be effective in reducing reoffending by women. However, alternatives to imprisonment often don't take into consideration the specific requirements of women. And for example, their caretaking responsibilities or potential histories of domestic violence. Also, there are gender differences in things like drug dependency, and treatment, as all healthcare treatment, should also take into account the gender-specific needs of women. Oops. Then the next population I'd like to talk about is children and youth in prison. So the UN Global Study on Children Deprived of Liberty, which was published 2 years ago, documents that over 400,000 children are detained in remand centers and prisons every year. And also, in addition to that, 1 million children are held in police custody. The age at which children can be held criminally responsible varies across the world. So it can be as low as 7 or up to 18 years. So the criminal responsibility age means that children above this age can be arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned. And there's even children being sentenced to life imprisonment and the death penalty around the world. In September 2019, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child revised their guidance, and they now recommend that the absolute minimum age of criminal responsibility should be 14 years of age. It was 12 years previously. The most common age across UN member states is around 14 years, actually. In many countries, there's child-specific legislation, so child-friendly courts and specialized procedures for children which seek to divert children away from the criminal justice system. However, this is not the case in many other countries. Many countries also criminalize status offenses of children, so behavior that would not be a criminal offense if it was committed by an adult, but it is when it's committed by a child. This includes truancy, violating curfew laws, possessing alcohol or tobacco. There's also often a blurring of the boundaries between children who commit offenses and children who actually need protection. For example, children living on the street, children with mental illness, and child sex workers often find themselves criminalized when in fact they would really need protection from the criminal justice system. And young adults in prison, so those aged 18 and above, have also been shown to experience high rates of traumatic backgrounds, mental health issues, and also a lack of maturity, as we now know that psychological evidence shows that parts of the brain associated with impulse control continue to develop well into adulthood. And also in many countries, reintegration and rehabilitation services for children, where they exist, do not include specific support for returning then to the community. And it should also be noted that children from ethnic minorities and indigenous communities are especially discriminated against and imprisoned at higher rates. Now talking about older persons in prison, this is a population that has been on the rise. There is no exact global data on the number of older persons in prison, but in some countries it's quite low, 1.8% in Indonesia, but 20% in Japan. And there are varying reasons for the aging prison population. For example, in Japan, older populations are reported to commit crimes in the context of poverty and social isolation. In contrast, in the United States, the aging populations are driven by punitive sentencing laws with mandatory minimum sentences, which were initiated in the 1980s. So this means there's an increase in the number of life sentences, and therefore people remain in prison at the end of their lives. Accelerated aging in prison means that people in prison over the age of 50 are often considered old. This is compared to 60 or 65 in the community because of the lower health status and the aging effect of prison itself. So research in some countries suggests that up to 90% of older people in prison have at least one moderate or severe health condition, and more than half have 3 or more. This means this population has specific needs which are often overlooked, leading to a violation of their human rights, specifically the right to dignity, for example. And also the research suggests that detaining older people is very often unnecessary because the crime rates of older people are incredibly low. It might be inappropriate because this population has specific healthcare needs that cannot be addressed in prisons, and it's also not cost effective. So a considerable number of older people who then actually spend the end of their lives in prison pose a minimal risk to public safety. Because if someone is, for example, unable to move in a wheelchair or has dementia, their risk for public safety is very low. However, when countries have early release mechanisms, they often do not include older people or terminally ill people. So many older people die in prison without support and without their families being with them in the last days. So this is a very complex population, and prisons are designed for younger people and able people. So meaning that the infrastructure is inadequate. So if someone is in a wheelchair, they might not be able to access certain parts of a prison. They might not be able to wash themselves. And also rehabilitation programs such as education or work or sports might not be suitable for older people. So they have challenges that are not really encountered. Sorry, I got lost a little bit here. Right. Also, in addition to that, mental health conditions such as depression and anxiety are really common among older persons as well. So you can see there's many hardships that older people in prison have experienced while their population has been increasing. And now with the COVID-19 pandemic, they've been at an increased risk once again, as they are more likely to contract COVID-19 and also have a higher risk of death due to the many underlying conditions and the inability to socially distance in prison. So at the end of 2020, 69 UN member states continue to criminalize consensual same-sex relationships, with life imprisonment or the death penalty possible in some countries. Even where homosexuality and diverse gender identities are not explicitly criminalized, LGBTIQ people are at high risk of arrest because of the way other laws can be used against them. At least 34 UN member states have legal provisions that restrict freedom of expression on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity. And at least 41 prevent the registration or operation of any civil society or organizations that work on those issues. So research shows that LGBTQ people are detained at disproportionate rates, but there's little official or conclusive data. you can imagine that it remains extremely difficult to obtain data, mainly because of the invisibility of this population inside and outside of prison settings. So the data is unavailable and the numbers are underestimated due to people fearing further discrimination and violence if they identify as LGBTIQ. But there's some data, some research recently on trans women in Latin America, which concluded that trans women represent a significant proportion in prison, exceeding 30% in Mexico City and in Bolivia. The study found that high proportions of trans women detained are charged or convicted of drug-related offenses. In Thailand, recent estimates suggest that transgender persons make up 2.6% of the prison population. And in Brazil, the penitentiary administration reported that more than 10,000 people in prison identify as part of the LGBTIQ community. This community continues to be subjected to discriminatory practices, physical, sexual, and psychological violence within prison settings. So either from prison authorities, staff, or other people in prison. They may be held in poorer conditions than the rest of the prison population, or they even might be isolated and put in solitary confinement on the grounds of protection, sometimes for years at a time. Also, trans people and intersex people may be refused gender-appropriate healthcare or even face ill treatment by healthcare professionals. In 2006, in response to well-documented patterns of abuse, a group of international human rights experts met in Yogyakarta, Indonesia, to outline international principles relating to sexual orientation and gender identity. In 2017, this panel of experts then published additional principles, and these are called the Yogyakarta Principles. Principle 9 outlines the right to treatment with humanity while in detention. However, this is not a legally binding document. Now, people with disabilities, a significant number of criminal justice systems lack strategies or policies to meet their needs. But this also means then that there is not a lot of global data on how many people in prison live with a disability. However, country-specific data suggests that it is a significant proportion of people in prison that have one or multiple disabilities that can be both physical and mental. For example, in Australia, it is estimated that around 18% of the that people with disabilities are 18% of the general population, but almost 50% of people entering prison. So challenges for people with disabilities in prison can range from access to healthcare and also lack of support in daily activities. People living with physical disabilities might be unable to participate in rehabilitative activities, and in overcrowded facilities, their disability might be magnified and they don't get the individualized care or attention that they need. And people with intellectual disabilities may need support with day-to-day tasks, such as reading, writing, or personal hygiene, also needs that are frequently not met in prisons. In addition, they are often at risk of violence or abuse at the hands of other people in prison and prison staff. International law stipulates that persons diagnosed with mental disabilities or severe health conditions that would be worsened by imprisonment should in fact not be in prison, but should be transferred to appropriate healthcare facilities in the community. However, this is just international law and often not enforced in practice. Foreign nationals in prison comprise a large proportion. Worldwide, nearly 500,000 foreign nationals are detained in countries that are not their own. In January 2020, they made up 15% of the prison population in Europe. However, there's high percentages found in the Middle East, with more than 1 in 2 people in prison being a foreigner. It's highest in the United Arab Emirates, where the proportion is over 90%. Common offenses that persons with foreign nationalities are detained for are immigration-related offenses and also drug offenses. So this increase is due to several factors, including the mass movement of people around the world. And there's also ongoing punitive approaches to immigration-related offenses and drug policies, which impact this population at disproportionate rates. They might be targeted by police and then encounter language barriers. Because of language barriers, they might not be able to access legal aid and they also experience discriminatory sentencing. So this population is often really invisible and experiences different kinds of discrimination, such as isolation in prison, limited or no family contact, limited understanding of the prison regime, and also challenges linked to their status, immigration status, such as deportation. This also means that they have difficulty in accessing adequate rehabilitation programs because they're often linked to then having a place to go after they're released from prison. One right that this population should have in theory is access to consular support, although diplomatic missions are often not able or willing to provide this to all foreign nationals in prison. The pandemic actually has posed specific issues for this population because transfers effectively came to a halt with travel restrictions and border closures. This has been noted in Europe, for example, where there was an almost total suspension under the existing prisoner transfer agreements and the EU instrument on transfers. So people belonging to national, ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities are disproportionately represented at all stages of the criminal justice system as a result of discriminatory laws and policies. The proportion of indigenous peoples, for example, continues to rise in Canada, Mexico, Australia, and New Zealand. There's again limited data, but it is clear that people belonging to national, ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities face discrimination and often avert violence even at the hands of authorities. They're also at increased likelihood of receiving longer prison sentences and the imposition of the death penalty. So there's been recent demonstration again of the widespread discrimination faced by this group with the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. Data available on COVID-19 in the community shows that minorities are more likely to be infected with COVID or in fact die from COVID. Although the exact data, as you can imagine, is hard to come by and the reasons remain to be explored comprehensively. Okay, then our next topic is healthcare and well-being in prison. So virtually all people in prison will eventually return to their communities, many within a few months to a year. Health in prisons is therefore closely connected to the health of the wider society. Prison health is public health, there is no distinction. International law requires the rights for all people, including those deprived of their liberty, to enjoy the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. The importance of the principle of equivalence, so meaning that people in prison are entitled to the same standard of healthcare as is available in the general public without discrimination of the legal status, is a principle that's enshrined in the Nelson Mandela rules. However, in practice, the healthcare services many people in prison receive is inferior to that available in the wider community, and some do not receive any treatment at all for their needs. So people in prison have multiple vulnerabilities to communicable diseases. Globally, prisons are characterized by high prevalence of HIV, hepatitis B, C, and tuberculosis, as well as diminished access to health services. In some settings, the HIV burden among people in prisons may be up to 50 times higher than in the general population. HIV transmission in prison often occurs through multi-use of equipment among people who use drugs, consensual or coerced sexual practices, unsafe skin piercing, tattooing, then multi-use of shaving razors, and then the improper sterilization or reuse of medical and dental instruments. Also, HIV in prison is often transmitted from mothers living with HIV to their babies during pregnancy or delivery. Up to 50% of people in prison use or inject drugs. So in prison, unsafe drug injecting practices are a major risk factor for HIV and hepatitis C. So addressing the healthcare needs of people in prison, including people in prison who use drugs, is a critical challenge for not just public health reasons, but also successful rehabilitation. This includes providing harm reduction measures. The evidence for harm reduction is strong and consistent for decades now, However, such programs are rarely implemented in prisons. Because of political, legal, and other barriers, the introduction or expansion of opioid substitution therapy or needle and exchange programs is hindered in many countries. Unfortunately, many countries take a criminal justice approach to healthcare in prisons, especially to drug use in prisons, rather than a public health approach. Healthcare in prisons should always be evidence-based, human rights-based, and gender responsive. This is mandated by some of the international standards, such as the Nelson Mandela rules, and also the Bangkok rules, which outline the gender-specific healthcare needs of women in prison. Also, it's important to mention, for transgender individuals, access to hormones and medicines is needed in order to ensure their sound mental and physical health, and it is part of their right to health. Of course, we cannot talk about health in prisons without talking about COVID. People in prison continue to be left behind in COVID responses, despite their heightened risk of infection and illness. So there's typical characteristics of the prison environment which contribute to the heightened exposure of this population to the virus. COVID-19 infection prevention measures, which are commonly implemented in the community, physical distancing, hygiene measures, isolation, quarantine, are difficult, if not impossible, to implement in prisons. Prisons are frequently overcrowded and facilities are cramped, and often there's poor ventilations. The people in prison they live, work, eat, and sleep in close proximity to one another. And in addition, there was limited access to testing at the beginning of the pandemic, and in some places even now, and there's not enough personal protective equipment for people in prison or prison staff, and sometimes not even sufficient clean water and hand washing facilities. And this challenge then is compounded by the complex healthcare needs of many people in prisons, which I've just outlined. So the higher rates of diseases and the higher risk of older people in prison. Then when we talk about mental health, it's particularly concerning that around 40% of people in prison have mental health conditions. And the mental well-being among prison populations is much lower than in the community. These rates are even higher for women in prison. People in prison have poor mental health, often because they have backgrounds associated with poverty, unemployment, violence, stress, social exclusion, substance dependencies, and so on. So these backgrounds can contribute to their mental ill health and sometimes also to criminality. However, imprisonment is also often the result of mental ill health. Other times, mental health is a contributing factor to offending. So some people may commit crimes as a result of their conditions, and they might be arrested or convicted because there's prejudice in the criminal justice system against people with mental health issues. On the other hand, then, imprisonment has been proven to cause and make worse mental ill health. So long sentences, uncertainties about the future, lack of support in prisons, they can all contribute to mental ill health amongst prisoners. And then also they might have limited contact with their friends and family outside of prison, and then they might be using drugs in prison, overcrowding, poor conditions, harassment, abuse, so many factors in prison that can make the mental health of people in prison even worse. So the UN Nelson Mandela rules state that people with severe mental health issues should not be imprisoned. And when they are in prison, they should have available appropriate mental health support through psychologists and psychiatrists. However, many prisons are under-resourced, understaffed, and cannot provide adequate mental health care for people in prison or for prison staff. So suicide is often the single most common cause of death in custody. This is especially the case in Europe and in Oceania. So factors that impact health in prisons, there are so many different factors that can contribute to this. I'm not going to go through all of them. Just overcrowding is one of the most important ones. It's a contributing factor of so many health issues in prison, and also solitary confinement. And in terms of laws and policies, I want to mention drug policies, which often, if they're punitive and harsh, means there's lack of access to harm reduction, which can have fatal effects on the health and lives of people in prison. Right, so most people in prison return to their communities, many within a year. And people who have served prison sentences should be able to return to their communities with an outlook and skills which will keep them from re-offending and re-entering prison. Prison sentences should seek to reduce re-offending through rehabilitation, and rehabilitation should address the root causes, the reasons for criminal behavior, and seek to improve the lives of those convicted. So some key facts about rehabilitation. People in prison often come from poorer sections of society. I've said this before, and these factors need to be addressed, or there's a risk of reoffending. Steady employment is one of the best guarantees against reoffending. So there's been a study, for example, in the US, which states that employment after leaving prison can reduce recidivism by as much as 50%. However, there is substantial problems, of course, with people living in prison being able to find a job and also housing, which then impacts their rehabilitation prospects negatively. Contact with and support from family and community is also a really important factor for successful reintegration. This can provide support and structure during the transition back into society. However, when people are in prison, it's often really difficult to keep contact with those people in their lives. Parole can also act as a strong incentive to work towards release, but there's so many justice systems around the world who do not allow for parole, where parole is not a factor in their criminal justice system. And then, of course, there's stigma attached to imprisonment. That can affect mental health of people in prison, but also really damage their chances of rehabilitation and reintegration. For example, finding employment and reconnecting with their social support networks after they're released. So the Nelson Mandela rules stipulate that prisons should offer different kinds of rehabilitation programs: education, vocational training, work, and other assistance that's needed for rehabilitation, resocialization. But certain groups in prison are particularly unlikely to receive this support. I've already mentioned the difficulties for older persons before. And in some countries, people in prison who serve short-term sentences are excluded from or unable to participate in rehabilitation programs. Women are also often at a disadvantage because rehabilitation programs are designed for the majority male prison population and might just provide gender stereotyped activities for women, such as cooking or sewing, which is not really helpful for gaining employment after they're released. So there is many different forms of rehabilitation and reintegration activities around the world. There's different examples such as prison farms or innovative post-release mentoring schemes. There's activities such as teaching women in prison how to code, all kinds of things. But it's a difficult task. And it needs significant resources and political will to implement those programs successfully. And also limited resources mean that educational and vocational opportunities that should go together with other kinds of health treatments, such as drug dependence treatment, alcohol treatment programs, are not implemented in practice. Any rehabilitation programs that are successful need to be holistic and individualized and have to take into account the needs of the person and the reasons why they came into contact with the criminal justice system at all. There are some key international standards for outlining rehabilitation and reintegration of people in prison. I've listed some of them here on the slide. So, alternatives to imprisonment. There are many international instruments that recommend alternatives to imprisonment for a variety of groups and types of offenses. In 2020, because of the COVID pandemic, some governments took urgent steps to decrease their prison population and implemented alternatives to imprisonment to reduce the risk of mass outbreaks of coronavirus in prisons. So my organization, PRI, and the international human rights community at large, including UN bodies, have all called for this, for political will to reduce prison populations and utilize alternatives for long-term sustainable prison reform. The Tokyo Rules, which are the United Nations standard minimum rules for non-custodial measures, which were adopted by the General Assembly resolution in 1990, provide a set of basic principles to promote the use of non-custodial measures and sanctions, as well as minimum safeguards for persons who are subjected to alternatives to imprisonment. They are based on the premise that those alternatives can be effective and to the best advantage both of the individual person and society. So some of the key principles are on the slide now. In addition, the UN Bangkok rules give guidance on gender-sensitive alternatives for women in prison, as not just imprisonment itself, but also alternatives should be taking account of the specific needs of women, which are often very different than the needs of men. And also with regard to alternatives to imprisonment for children, there is the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which states unequivocally that no child shall be deprived of his or her liberty unlawfully or arbitrarily. The arrest, detention, or imprisonment of a child shall be in conformity with the law and shall be used only as a measure of last resort. So there are specific rules on children in conflict with the law, the Beijing rules, which also stress the need for alternatives to imprisonment and non-custodial measures for children. So here is a range of different alternatives that are implemented by some countries. Some implement all of them, just some of them. And there's different evidence base for all of these in terms of rehabilitation and reoffending, but we don't have time to get into this right now. So alternatives to imprisonment are a solution because there's little research that would suggest that prison is a deterrent. Prison sentences do not deter people from committing crimes. The opposite is often true. Once someone has served a sentence of imprisonment, they are more likely to re-offend. So if the goal is to reduce offending, then the likelihood of being caught, so an effective justice system, is more effective in deterring than the prospect of a long and harsh prison sentence. Scientific evaluations of rehabilitative focused alternatives to detention show that they can effectively reduce reoffending more effectively even than prison sentences, because they address the reasons why people offend and why they come into contact with the justice system. This has been, for example, stated by a 2019 international review, which found that recidivism rates are lower for people who have served a community sentence compared to those who have served a prison sentence. And I'm repeating myself here, but it's important to restate that most people that are in prison have poor education, limited employment experience, and other kind of problems such as alcohol or drug dependence and mental health issues. So prison does not address any of those needs that they have and might even exacerbate and make worse the problems that they're facing, which means that they're less likely to reintegrate successfully into sentence. They experience social stigma and other problems. Alternatives to prison, they can provide a solution to at least some of those problems if they are implemented at a large scale with sufficient resources and with evidence-based measures. So the last topic that I want to briefly mention is the increased use of digital technologies in prisons and what this means for human rights. The use of technology is widespread within criminal justice and penitentiary systems. The primary purpose is the collection of electronic information and data to strengthen security and surveillance, but also to enhance opportunities for contact of people in prison with the outside world. So technology can make prisons safer for people in prison and for staff, and also for visitors, for example. And then for court and probation purposes, the use of technologies can enable information sharing, transparency, and so on. But also, there are some human rights considerations, and some experts note that the increased use of technology can impact the rights to fair trial and for people in prison and also on probation. So the past year specifically has seen rapid advances in the use of technological solutions in prisons and also in the wider criminal justice system, so even before people get into prison. Some prison systems look to those technologies as a means to combat the spread of coronavirus. so reducing the risk of transmission because of human contact. For example, a number of US jails introduced UVC robots for disinfection last year. So they emit high intensity ultraviolet light to destroy viruses and disinfect cells and eating utensils and all sorts of things. Or in China, infrared portals were introduced to check the temperature of each person before they entered the prisons. And robots to measure temperatures were also introduced in Hong Kong prisons to reduce the contact between staff and detainees. Then there's also increased use of telemedicine, so remote medical consultations, or telepsychology, so phone and internet-based services to provide mental health care in different kinds of prisons to lessen the number of external visits. Also, video visitation was used in prisons to replace in-person visits. So for example, Skyping, family members, and so on. Also, online access for training and education purposes is another use of technology in prisons. I already said as well, remote hearings and video conference courts have been used in many countries from Albania, Peru, Myanmar, Nigeria. Lots of countries are now experimenting with these kinds of technologies, and where those virtual courts already existed prior to the pandemic, their use has expanded significantly last year. This increased reliance on technological solutions has also deepened the digital divide. So some prison systems are really well resourced. For example, Sweden, where bandwidth has increased and lots of prisons have purchased new equipment, and people in prison have had a lot of access to these technologies last year. But other countries do not have those resources, and people in prison could not benefit from the technologies and were quite isolated and did not have access to a lot of those services. And the use of online hearings has also raised human rights concerns regarding due process, the ability to understand procedure, and confidentiality as well. And some international bodies have called for remand hearings to be held in person only wherever possible. For example, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights called for the physical presence of persons deprived of their liberty in custody hearings because video conferencing could negatively affect the detection of signs of torture, ill treatment, and coercion. So that was just the last topic I wanted to cover. With that, I want to say thank you for your attention. I really hope this was interesting to you, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
All right, so that wraps up our first session. Thank you so much, Ms. Edith, for the wonderful presentation. It has really helped us have more insights on the different dimensions of prisons, including the effects and also the unequal conditions of prisoners with different backgrounds as well. And also the main causes and problems found, especially in overcrowded prisons. And at this point, I believe that there might be some participants who have some questions in their minds, or anyone who would like to know more about the story of you or prisoners' rights. So may I take this chance to remind you that if you have any questions, participants are free to leave them in the chat box in Zoom or in the line group of the event as well. So we will collect them at the Q&A session at the end. Until then, let's move on to the next session that I'm sure many participants are looking forward to, which is our panel discussion. In our panel discussion, we'll be focusing on the aspects of prisoners' rights and COVID-19, which Ms. Edith has kindly touched upon a little bit in the presentation already. And it's also a very current and prominent challenge in the world right now. And also the possible solutions and implementations that can be put forward as well. To start our discussion, I'd like to welcome Ms. Edith Riegler once again to the discussion floor, as well as our other moderator, Ms. Charasai, who will be joining us in this interactive session. Welcome.
Thank you, Ms. Tanyapat, so much for the introduction. Let me introduce myself once again. My name is Charasai Wangpanit, and I'll be joining Tanyapat as the moderator for this session. So for the first part, which will be on the COVID-19 safety measures, I will now pass the floor back again to Tanyapat to begin with our first question.
All right, so our first main subtopic here that we'd like to go a little bit deeper about is about the COVID-19 safety measures, which I believe you have discussed quite a bit about. So I'd like to ask you, how exactly has COVID affected the life of prisoners, both in the physical aspect and the mental aspect? So I believe that you've mentioned that mental aspect is also very important in prisons. So we'd like to know more how COVID-19 in particular has affected that aspect of prisoners.
That's such a good question, because when COVID hit the world, most people didn't really know what was happening and how dangerous the virus was, how it was spreading and all of that. But we on the outside had access to the news and to information and all of those things. And for so many people in prison, the reality was that they did not know. They heard of a virus being outside, killing people, but they didn't have a lot of evidence-based information on what's happening and also how to protect themselves. So we saw in quite a few countries riots of people in prison because they saw that there were more and more restrictions. So physical visitations were stopped. Rehabilitation programs, sports programs, vocational trainings, they were stopped to minimize contact. But then that meant that a lot of people were in quasi-isolation for long periods of time, which is scary, confusing, and also really impacts mental health. So this is one aspect. And then, of course, on the other hand, the physical threat that COVID-19 poses, I've mentioned it before in the presentation, but there is no possibility to implement social distancing measures in prison. So we saw really high rates of infections in some prisons. There have been outbreaks across the world. We don't have exact data, but a conservative estimate is that about 500,000 people in prison have been infected so far. So if we think that there's 11 million people in prison, 500,000 have had coronavirus, that's quite a large proportion compared to the general population. And over 4,000 people in prison have died as a result. Again, this is a conservative estimate because, of course, we cannot just close off prisons and not let anyone in. Prison staff, the prison guards, healthcare personnel, cleaners, cooks, they all move in between prison and the community. So the virus will always enter prisons.
All right, thank you so much for the answer. And I believe that that large number has shown us how great and to what an extent COVID has impacted prisons, and also that it doesn't only affect the physical aspect, but also the mental aspect. So it's something that the society should really work on right now. It just shows how large the extent is. So that also leads me to my next question, which is, do you think the healthcare system in prisons is enough? Obviously, there are a lot of gaps in between, as you have said, but where in particular do you think that these gaps should be fixed first? Like, what is the most urgent thing that should be fixed in order to improve the prison conditions in relation to COVID-19?
I believe there's such variance in the prison conditions when it comes to healthcare in countries. Some countries, like I said, they are quite progressive and they try to not only have services for mental health, but all kinds of physical health. They have HIV testing, they have drug dependence treatment and all kinds of things. And then in some countries, of course, the resources are so low. So when there's not even clean water, it's hard to even talk about some of the more rare or difficult to access healthcare services. One thing that I think is really urgent, which is lacking in a lot of countries, is access to menstrual products for women. This is something extremely basic, but so many women in prison do not have access to it. And if there is access, they have to pay for it themselves, which is not possible. So I feel like the international standards on healthcare and the right to health for people in prison seem maybe like a bare minimum, but then the reality is so far off from that. So we really need to start at the very basics. So ventilation, access to enough food and high quality food and nutrition, especially for women that are pregnant or breastfeeding, then access to menstrual products. Some of the specific needs, like I mentioned, the healthcare needs of older people, you know, or people with disabilities, people that need specific medication for diabetes, or people who are transgender and need access to homotherapy, these are, you know, far off from the reality when there's basic healthcare that is not available in a lot of prisons.
Yes, I totally agree with your point, and it just shows how interconnected this whole issue is. So it's not only about fixing COVID-19 itself, but also about other aspects of healthcare, such as strengthening your immune system or having enough sanitary products or nutrition or food as well. So I think that I agree with you that it's a holistic approach that should be taken really seriously. And as you've also mentioned about the international standards, right, about the Nelson Mandela rules imposing minimum health standards for prisons. So would you say that this standard is enough, or are there any things that the countries are trying to do in response to COVID-19 in the present in particular?
I think it's not enough. If we talk about equivalence of care, noting that people in prison should have the same level of healthcare that is available in the community, it's not enough. Especially when we talk about COVID. Testing and treatment for COVID is not the same in prisons as it is in community. In most countries, it is not. And now when we talk about vaccinations for people in prison, there is no international standards and guidelines for this. We're just, you know, developing this ad hoc kind of like as we go. And we've seen now there is some research actually, Harm Reduction International and my organization, we're publishing very soon a report on vaccinations of people in prison. And we saw that the national vaccination plans of most countries did not include people in prison at all. So we all know that they're more vulnerable and they at a high risk of infection, but they weren't included at all. So then when they're not included in theory in the plans and the strategies, they will not be included in practice. So there's a lot of difficulties with that. And I think one of the reasons for that is that the healthcare in prison belongs to different ministries in different countries. So the recommendations by UN and other bodies is that prison healthcare should be part of the Ministry of Health. It is healthcare, so therefore Ministry of Health should take care of it. But in fact, often it's Ministry of Interior or Ministry of Justice that is in charge of providing healthcare in prisons, which of course then leads to this discrepancy. You know, there's then different kinds of standards and services that are provided to, on the one hand, people in the community and people in prison. So this is something that is slowly improving. More and more countries are shifting their prison healthcare to the ministries of health. There's international advocacy for that. But I think then once that is in place, then it's easier when a country is developing emergency response plans, whether it is for COVID or for other things like HIV or mental health or whatever, you know, they have to take into account then these populations that are deprived of their liberty as well.
Hi, Edith. Can I ask some questions?
Sure.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Engelbert. In regards about the COVID transmission, my question is, we know each country has different situation or setup on the prisons, but is there any standards that you could recommend other than like we have standards in our country, but is there any standards from in your aspects that could we add on to prevent this COVID transmission? And also another question to follow up is that how does the tuberculosis in relation to HIV transmission?
Thank you very much. So what has been recommended by, for example, WHO and UNODC and other UN bodies and regional bodies is that the most effective measure to address COVID-19 transmission in prisons is to get people out of prison. That's it. So of course we can implement social distancing. We can make sure that no visitors are coming into prisons. We can give everyone masks and disinfectant and all of that. But prisons are still highly densely populated places, there is no possibility for quarantine or all of those things. So it has been acknowledged by the international community that, decongesting prisons is the standard we should aim for. And so many countries have done that. They have either suspended sentences. So a lot of people that were supposed to go into prison during the pandemic, they just had to wait at home, and they might be called to serve the prison sentences now. There have been temporary releases. There have also been a lot of pardons. For example, Iran has released a huge proportion of their prisoners during COVID-19 because the prisons were overcrowded, but they did not include political prisoners, for example. But vulnerable populations have been released in a lot of countries. But there is a problem with mass releases, of course, because I talked about the importance of reintegration and rehabilitation programs. So there always needs to be a close connection between prison services and services in the community. So when people are released, they need somewhere to go, they need support, especially when it comes to healthcare. So if someone is receiving treatment in prison, they should receive it in the community. You know, there needs to be a post-release plan in place to make sure that people don't reoffend. So if all of a sudden thousands of people are released, for a lot of people, then they were like, where do I go? What do I do? I don't have means to support myself. I am homeless now. And then all of those things, of course, don't help with the reintegration of people in prison, but also don't help with the limiting the spread of COVID. So I hope I answered that question satisfactorily. And then when it comes to tuberculosis, so tuberculosis, of course, is an airborne disease. So wherever there's cramped conditions and no ventilation and all of that, it spreads quite easily, and it weakens the immune system. I'm not a biologist or a healthcare professional. I don't have medical training, but from what I've learned working in the HIV/AIDS section is that there's a lot of co-infection. There's also a lot of co-infection between hepatitis and HIV that often is because of the sharing of injection equipment, but it just weakens the immune system, of course. You have pneumonia, your body doesn't have the required antibodies, and then when we think about this population, high population is co-infected with HIV and TB in the prisons, and then COVID hits, those people are really at risk. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Edith. Yeah, I understand, especially on this, the one that you told us recently about the continuous plans on the healthcare. It is very, very, very nice, very good if we can apply that. But I think unfortunately in our country we have plans, but it affects the budget, and it needs to be addressed also. But we are glad that other persons outside the country is concerning about that. It would be nice, but we cannot compare in other like in your country. It's a Western country. There's a lot that you have continuous plans, even though we have, but we have limited budgets. We're talking about these budgets.
Yeah.
And yeah, thank you so much. That's it for now, because so many questions is coming up for you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just want to add quickly to that. Yes, there's discrepancy between countries and what is available, but even in some Western countries, the situation is not ideal. In fact, there's some examples where this kind of connection to services in the community after prison works maybe not better, but quite well in countries with very low resources, because in those cases, it's not the government then providing those services, but civil society organizations, lots of NGOs that work with that. And sometimes then, for example, it's the UN giving those people funding and resources and support to do the job and the work that the government is not able to do. Also in some countries, it's not just a question of not enough resources, but of instability. You know, we think of a country like Sudan, where there is no functioning government, and then of course you kind of expect this population then to receive the services that we would like them to have. So sometimes then it's small, local, grassroots, underground NGOs that do, you know, limited work, but really important work that the government doesn't have the capacity to do.
All right, thank you so much for the response and also for the very interesting addition question from the participants as well. That has allowed us to gain even more insight and also a specific case study from.
Hi, Miss.
So I see that there's someone who would like to ask another question. So the person raising your hand, please go ahead.
Miss Edith. Yeah, hi. Good afternoon here. I'm from Philippines. I'm just concerned with the maximize space, or like, inside the prison there are a lot of prisons.
Oh, we lost her.
I think the connection from the participant is a little bit unstable. So maybe could the participant please recheck the connection?
Or ask the question in the chat, maybe.
Yes, maybe that would be a great idea. You could type the question in the chat and I'll relay it to Ms. Edith. Meanwhile, I do have another question following up from the last discussion. I believe that the last discussion also touched upon other diseases such as tuberculosis and HIV. So one of the questions that I'd like to ask you is whether we can learn from previous outbreaks. Has there been?
Hi.
Okay.
I'm really.
Hello, it seems as if our participant is back. So maybe we can go to the participant's question first,
Sure.
and then circle back. So please ask your question.
I'm really sorry for cutting off. My signal just went down. Okay, I'm so sorry. It's my signal just cut off. I'm really sorry to interrupt you there. It's just, yeah. Is there any way the government would find a solution to maximize more space for the prisoners, or, for example, there will be another prisoner to be detained or be imprisoned?
Okay, if I understand your question.
That will be my question.
Okay, if I understand it correctly, you mean to make sure that prisons are not as overcrowded, there's more space? Is that it? Okay, I'll address it this way. Yes, in fact, countries are building prisons all the time, more and more prisons.
Yes, that's my question.
Yeah, the problem is where this happens is then there's an incentive to keep the prison full. There's been some case studies, especially in the US, where then, prisons are overcrowded. More and more people are sentenced to prisons, and then they need space. They build new prisons, but then once the prison's there, it will need to be filled, to keep it working, because in so many places those prisons are located in really rural areas. Sometimes then a town slowly builds around the prison, and most people in the town work in some form or shape in the prison, that the prison is almost their source for their livelihoods. They work there, they create products that are used there, they cook there, all of those things. So then, of course, government leaders, mayors or whatever, they will have an incentive to keep the prison full. So this then in turn reinforces punitive sentencing. So in my view, building new prisons is not the main solution. It cannot be, because wherever there's a prison, it will need to be filled. I mean, there's also other examples. For example, a few years ago, prisons in the Netherlands were very empty. And the Netherlands has a lot of short sentences. So most of them are between a few months and a year. So, and they didn't fill all the prisons. So then they were actually importing prisoners from Norway or from Belgium, where the prisons are very full. So in theory, good idea, but then of course you're serving a sentence in a different country. You might not speak the language. You have no possibility of your family coming to visit you. How can you participate in rehabilitation activities when you don't speak the language? So this actually violates quite a few rights of the people in prison. the common position of the international bodies is not to recommend building new prisons, but instead seeing how can we, make sure that those who are committing low-level, non-violent offenses, for example, because they cannot pay a fine, they shouldn't go into prison. There's other sanctions, other measures that are in the community, or for example, pregnant women. There can be a variety of different sanctions in the community if there's no risk to public safety. So this is the recommendations of the international bodies instead of building more and more new prisons.
All right, thank you so much for the questions and answers. And for participants who still have some things they would like to say or ask, please don't worry, as we will have a Q&A session again at the end. So right now, we'd like to move on to another very interesting topic first. And for that, I'd like to invite Ms. Charasai to lead the discussion. And then later, any participants who have any other questions can save it for the Q&A session at the end as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nityapat. I believe that at this point, the participants here would like to hear more on this topic already. So if there is any question the participants would like to ask in regards to the legal trends of prisoner rights, there will also be an open discussion as well. So please feel free to press the raise hand button or type your question in the chat box later, and we'll circle back to you after the moderator's question. As for now, the first question we have for Ms. Edith is, how does the law play a role in securing prisoners' rights? Do you think it is currently sufficient to secure such rights?
In theory, yes. It's the application in practice, I think, that is lacking in most places. But I'm saying in theory, yes, to the most basic rights. Okay, so we have in international treaties and conventions, but also in a lot of domestic legislation, the right to dignity, to all of those things, right? They should suffice in most circumstances, but they're not enforced in practice in many places. But then if we think about different specific populations, there is no laws in a lot of cases. So we think about women in prison, there are international standards and even in domestic legislation that will refer to the rights of women in prison. But then if we think about populations like older people in prison, or something I'm very interested in, transgender people in prison, there are no laws, not even in modern Western northern countries, right? Like this is a forgotten population. So it's really hard to enforce rights when there is no laws about it. So do transgender people in prison have a right to be in housed in the place where they would like to? Is it a men's prison or a women's prison? Is it a separate wing or not? Do they have a right to dress and present themselves the way that they wish? Do they have a right to hormone therapy? Is hormone therapy part of the right to health? I have my own opinions about that, but the problem is the international community doesn't have a consensus. There is no international standard that we can refer to and be like, look, governments, the UN, for example, says this, we should follow it. There's laws really lacking in regards to specific populations.
Yes, I do agree that this problem is quite overlooked in their international level. So this would lead to my next question, which is, do you think there could be any changes in the law that could help with the standard of the living of these groups of people in prison? So maybe women are, maybe like the women or like the LGBTQ people, like, do you think there could be any suggestions in the law or any changes in the law to help with these people?
I think absolutely. The thing that's very sad is that those things are so slow, right? For any changes in laws, it needs a lot of advocacy and lobbying and convincing different stakeholders. So in some places, it's the case that the laws don't really change, but the practice changes. So there's, for example, a lot of countries where the law still criminalizes homosexuality, but it's not enforced in practice in a very punitive way. So sometimes those are, the transition periods, which, are on the road to maybe eventually changing laws. So I feel like, of course, we need to always promote the changing of laws to make them more human rights based and evidence based. This is a painstaking process, and even if there are international treaties and the UN agencies do a lot of lobbying and convincing and working together with governments, it is a long, hard process. So I feel like even on the ground, you know, if there's in a country one state, for example, that chooses to not, if they cannot change the laws, then put policies in place at least to make life better for some people in prison. I think sometimes this is as much as we can hope for in the short term.
Yeah, I do agree that it will be a long-term process, and maybe the enforcement is like the hardest part of it all. So that's it for my part. If there are any questions from the participants who have earlier raised their hand, please feel free to unmute your microphone to ask the question or also type in the chat box. And I will now pass the floor back to Ms. Tanyapat. Thank you.
Hello, welcome back. So here's our official Q&A session. So participants who have wanted to ask questions or share their thoughts earlier, now is your time to share your thoughts on the floor. So is there any questions coming from the floor? So I do see something from the chat box from one of the participants asking, expressing their opinion that instead of putting light offenders in prisons, make a program where these people will do community services, such as well as establishing industry activities where their energy instead shall be exchanged productively. So do you have any comments on that or anything you'd like to add to this opinion?
Yeah, I absolutely agree on a personal level, but also the research and the evidence base and the science is on my side as well. We know that like you said, low-level non-violent offenders, if they are given community services, community sanctions, and alternatives to imprisonment, the likelihood that they will commit a crime again is much, much lower. So this is definitely the way to go. However, we need to, you know, be smart about it and look at the evidence base and see what works and what is needed. You know, the same approach might not be effective for everyone. If someone has a substance dependence, for example, then you know, they might need support with that. And if there's a community service that doesn't include mental health support, substance dependence treatment, then it might not be effective, those kinds of things. So individualized is always the best, but of course this requires a huge amount of resources. But then at the end, the smart people that have done the calculations, you know, they say that we save money by doing that, because actually putting people in prison is incredibly expensive. Governments spend so much money on locking people up. So sometimes the ratio, actually in many countries, the ratio of prison staff to people in prison is 1-on-1. So you can imagine just on staff costs, how much governments spend on incarcerating people. So divesting that money into community sanctions actually financially makes sense.
Right, thank you so much for that insight into an alternative solution. That sounds really promising to the prison situation right now. So I believe there's time for one final question. And I see that one of the participants has raised their hands. So the participant raising their hand can feel free to open your microphone and ask the question, please.
Hello, ma'am. I just want just one question. We know that UN tends to do something like a treaty or some sort, like the Refugee Treaty of 1951, to do some standard to it. Is it possible that in the near future, the UN or some world governing body is going to put a treaty or going to force the countries to do some kind of standards that would make the assembly follow it, instead, just to make sure that the hygiene and all that won't replicate what happened with COVID and as of this moment? Thank you.
That is such a good question. And I do believe so. I mean, this pandemic has affected every part of society in so many ways that we are struggling to comprehend right now. And there have been other epidemics and public health threats in prisons before. I think you, Tanyapat, you were touching upon it earlier. There have been cholera outbreaks in prisons really recently in Haiti and in Kenya. There have been Ebola and different kinds of public health threats in prisons. And so these were on a lower scale. So, you know, it doesn't really get the attention of the international community. But we know now that, you know, COVID is just one virus that we're now dealing with, but the likelihood that different epidemics and pandemics will meet us in the future is very high. So we need to be prepared in terms of public health, which of course then also includes people in prison as well, and prison health. So I think there is a recognition that this is needed and important, and also with a view to disasters of many different kinds. I see now that different UN bodies are looking also at the broader genre of natural disasters and natural hazards. So many countries are dealing with climate change, which then has floods and extreme weather, tornadoes, which can disrupt electricity and water and roads and infrastructure. And then, of course, all of that doesn't just affect the community, but also prisons, because prisons are part of the community. And then how do we deal with that? So I think lots of the international bodies and also countries are realizing we need emergency preparation and response plans. We need to think about this in advance. When an emergency hits us, whether it's extreme weather or whether it's a virus, a public health thing, we need to be prepared. And I think we're now really seeing that there's no way around it. Those things will be happening again and again in the future, and we need to be prepared. So I'm really hopeful and optimistic that this is something we're grappling with, and I can see that, you know, this is part of discussions at events, for example, the Human Rights Council. So once it's, you know, part of the discussion, I do foresee that there might be a resolution on this in the near future, because it is so urgently needed, just to be prepared for future emergencies and to not leave the most vulnerable people behind.
I totally agree with that final point of yours, and I also believe that the international level discussions that have been made will surely make progress in our society about prison reform. Thank you so much for all your questions and all your answers as well. Unfortunately, as time is running out, we'll have to wrap up our Q&A session and panel discussion now. But thank you once again to Ms. Edith Riegler for all the insights and also engaged in this lively interactive discussion session as well. At this time, I'd like to thank Ms. Edith Riegler once again for the useful information and also for sharing the expertise. It has been our pleasure with us and also on your views on this matter. As this event has come to an end, I'd like to invite the Secretary General of ALSA Thailand to give a closing speech. Please welcome Ms. Benyapha Keltinda.
Thank you, Khun Tanyapat. It's my honor to be providing the closing remarks for today's event. First and foremost, on behalf of ALSA Thailand National Board and participants, I would like to take this opportunity to express our gratitude toward our honorable expert, Ms. Edith Riegler, who has dedicated valuable time to share her expertise with us. I'm also grateful towards all our ALSA Thailand National Board members who have put all their effort into perfecting the event today. Lastly, I would like to thank all participants for joining us. We hope that our events had provided all of you with more profound comprehensions on the topic of prisoner rights. Ladies and gentlemen, since the Prison Missions Avoiding Life Behind Bar webinar is part of our social issue series called Rolling in the Feed, we look forward to seeing you again in our next episode. Once again, thank you very much for attending this event. I now proclaim this as the end of the Prison Missions Evolving Life Behind Bar webinar. ALSA always be one.
Thank you so much, Ms. Penyapa, for the closing remarks. Well, everyone, that wraps up our workshop, which is a kickstart for our social issues series rolling in the feed. We also would like to say that if you have any more questions or concerns, you can contact or send a message to the email that has been put in the chat box to the Prison Reform Institution or to Ms. Edith Riegler directly. And we also would like to remind you that for those of you who are interested in financial law as well, we also have another series on law and finance called the Wolf of Law Street series. So if anyone is interested in our future events, you can also follow us on Instagram at ALSA Thailand. On behalf of ALSA Thailand, thank you to all of you for having time and making time in your schedule to join us today. It's been our pleasure and our honor to host this event, and we wish you all a pleasant day. We apologize for any inconveniences that may occur today as well. Finally, we would like to remind you once again that there are 2 forms which you need to fill in to receive the e-certificate for the event. First, there is a survey form, and second, there's a form for the certificates. The link to both forms has been sent through the chat box, or you can also scan it here on the screen as well. So once again, make sure that you fill both of the forms so we can provide you with the e-certificate. Thank you to all of you, and see you next event. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure. Thanks for the discussions and for having me.
Thank you so much for sharing your ideas as well.
Have a good day, everyone.